There is an important question about God and evidence. Does the evidence support the existence of God, or does it not support the existence of God, either by being inconclusive or by supporting the non-existence of God? This question has nothing whatsoever to do with this video. This video is about the question, if the evidence is inconclusive, or if, as far as I know, the evidence is inconclusive, if only because I haven't had time to study it properly, what should I do? Should I believe that God exists till I have evidence against? Or should I believe that God does not exist till I have evidence for the existence of God? Or should I have no opinion on the matter? This is the question which is nicely summarized by the term presumption of atheism. Antony Flew, a British philosopher in the 1900s, wrote a nice book in which he argues for the presumption of atheism. And the presumption of atheism is the non-belief in the existence of God until the evidence should rule in favor of the existence of God. Now, Flew specifies that this atheism he's talking about is not the belief in the non-existence of God, but simply the non-belief in the existence of God. So his answer to the question is you should not have any opinion until the evidence rules in favor of the existence of God. Other philosophers, of course, will say you should believe that God does not exist until there is good evidence. They would agree with Flew on the presumption of atheism as he has defined it, but they would go a little further. They might appeal to the principle of Occam's razor. Don't believe in anything unless you have good evidence for it. Now, Flew makes an interesting argument for the presumption of atheism. He says that it is appropriate, it is good, it is necessary, it is something we should do to try as hard as we can to believe only what we know. And knowledge requires evidence, and so we should only believe in the existence of God if we have good evidence for it. Now that's a nice argument for the presumption of atheism. And it's important to keep in mind that this presumption of atheism question is, as Flew explains, something that can be overruled by the evidence. He compares it to the presumption of innocence in a courtroom setting, at least in some systems of law, the English system, for example, in the American system, where the defendant is considered innocent until proven guilty, but he can be proven guilty. God is presumed not to exist, or is not presumed to exist until evidence is presented. But evidence may be presented, and if it is good enough, then one should believe in the existence of God. And so Flew specifies that Thomas Aquinas himself, the great Christian medieval philosopher, believes in the presumption of atheism. And he argues that this is the case and appeals to a remark by Aquinas in some of his writings. Now, Flew also himself later stopped being an atheist and began to believe in the existence of God based on the evidence, but never abandoned the question of the presumption of atheism, which is not the conclusion that God does not exist, but more the procedural question. The procedural question that you should proceed from the assumption that this theory that God exists is not correct until it has good evidence for it. Well, that's all very interesting and important, but there are philosophers arguing to the contrary. William James, in his essay, originally a speech given to the philosophical clubs of Yale and Brown University in the late 1800s, William James argues against the presumption of atheism. He says it is actually perfectly acceptable to believe in the absence of convincing evidence. And he makes two interesting arguments for this. Very briefly, I'll just say something about one of those arguments. He says that whether to be religious is a choice. It is a choice between whether to have at least one religious belief or no religious beliefs. And that is a choice you cannot avoid making. It is also a momentous choice. That is to say, it is a choice that will affect the rest of our lives, not just the afterlife. In fact, in The Will to Believe, James leaves the afterlife almost entirely aside. He's talking about the effects of religion, the practical effects of religion on the rest of your life. And he says it's a momentous decision because it does affect how you live. And also, for many of us, it is what he calls a live decision. That is to say, we could go either way. Now, James says that when life forces you to make a decision, and you could go either way, and the decision has momentous consequences, it is okay to choose to believe one option rather than the other, choose to go one way or the other, choose to do one thing rather than the other, even without convincing evidence, because life simply forces you to do this. The question whether I should become a philosopher or a dentist, or the question of name two occupations you can imagine yourself taking up, is or will be, or at some point in the past, has been for you a question much like this. It has been one where you could have gone either way. You had to choose, and it was a momentous decision that affected the rest of your life. And you may have lacked convincing evidence one way or the other. So Flew says you have to believe only what you have good evidence for, because we should try as hard as we can to believe only what we know to be true. A nice argument, but William James says there are other rules that should regulate how we conduct our beliefs. And one of them is the rule that we should do what is practical and useful. And sometimes, simply as a practical matter, you must choose to do something without convincing evidence, without necessarily knowing that it is the right way to go yet, although evidence may come later.